webinar. This is organized jointly by OR UK and the FRCS Mentor Group. The presenter this evening is Mr. Alan Norrish. He's a senior fellow, senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham and a senior clinical fellow at the University Hospitals of Nottingham. Alan is a PhD degree in basic sciences from University of Cambridge, and he's very well known to present internationally on subjects related to basic sciences in orthopedics. He's also very active doing other projects related to orthopedics in patient safety and clinical governance. He's particularly clinically interested in hip and knee surgery, as well as in orthopedic trauma surgery, with emphasis on limb reconstruction and bone infection. And he has over 40 publications cited for his name. So we are very pleased that he's kindly accepted to be our guest tonight. And I'm certain that all of us will learn a lot from him. I'm Firas Arnaout. I will be moderating this session association with Ruth from OR UK, as well as my fellow mentors will be ready to support you during the Viva part and also during the questions. So we will start by having a lecture. This will be followed by answering any questions you have. We will try to answer as much as you can in the chat box for you. And we will leave a couple of interesting questions at the end to ask Alan. There will be MCQ questions after the lecture, so we encourage you all to listen very carefully so you can answer the questions, but it will be anonymous. So you can please encourage you all to take part. After that, there will be a case-based discussions where Alan will kind of present us with 3 very interesting cases, and he's going to present us with a model answer on how to answer these scenarios in the exam. Afterwards, we will start our Viva practice. So it'll be hot seat Viva as usual, and we understand the stress you are under, and we will support you and allow you time and to answer questions and try to help you out with reduce the stress and help you to manage basically talking to examiners. We'll give you feedback on this. So, but there'll be only 3 questions. So if anyone is interested, please express your interest as soon as possible. And we only can have 3 candidates for the hot seat tonight. This will be followed by, and that's the reason why, is because then there's an additional short talk afterwards, about 15 minutes. This will be focusing from the 2 candidates who successfully passed the exam a couple of weeks ago, and they're going to present us with how the new format of the clinical part is structured. And because now the clinical components of the exam has changed. There are no patients anymore, so it's all examiner based and case based, discussion based. So they were going to let us know how did that go for them and what they learned, and to allow the future candidates to prepare better. So thank you very much for logging in. Without further ado, I will leave you with Mr. Norrish, our guest tonight.
Thank you so much, Firas. That's very helpful. And I'm just going to share my screen with you, if that's okay. And then I'll start my talk. So, as you mentioned, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but I've got an interest in basic science. And I can see so many of you have logged on tonight, so you must also have that same interest in learning more. And I remember when I was studying for my exam, lots of the things that we were studying seemed to make quite a lot of intuitive sense. I was pretty comfortable with some of the basic science, like the anatomy. But then suddenly there was this whole subject about materials and material science and material behavior that we'd never covered in medical school. We've never covered really in great detail anywhere else. And I was very intimidated by it. And I sort of made it a point of interest to try and learn as much as I could. And I've been teaching this particular area now for probably about 8 years. And this little talk, which I hope will get you through it's designed just to get you through mainly the questions about the materials that you might use in orthopedics, and to get you through any questions about the stress strain graph. So we have a limited objective, but on the other hand, I hope by the end of this sort of half an hour, you'll feel pretty comfortable with some of those things. So this is just before we start, this is just to give you an idea. This is taken from Ortho Bullets about the high yield basic science topics that come up in the MCQs. And you can see that orthopedic implants and material properties of implants are unusually high compared to perhaps some of the other things that you think come up. And so I do think this is a pretty important subject for us to get to grips with. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the definitions, some of the terms that are used in material science, and just try and make them clear for us all. And then I'm going to really focus in on the stress strain graph and what we can learn from it and where we can get some of those definitions. And then just towards the end of the talk, I want to talk specifically about hip and knee replacement, because that's the kind of question you might get asked in a Viva, and that'll be some of my case presentations along the lines of, oh, you know, Alan, what hip replacement do you use? And you think it's going to be a question about the evidence base for a certain prosthesis, but then they suddenly say, and what's that made out of? And why have you chosen that particular type of material? And what are the material properties? And I hope to be able to give you some good ideas on how to answer that. So let's start with a few definitions within material science. And so material science is really about exploring the properties of a material, but we can't just explore them by looking at a material. We actually have to apply a load to a material and see how that material behaves when a load is applied. And that's one of the key things about understanding material science, that it's how a material responds to a load which is applied to it. And of course, as you can imagine, a load is an externally applied force, and it can be applied in different directions, like compression or tension, shear or torsion. And as soon as we apply a load to a body, there's going to be some internal effects or deformations of that particular kind of body. And those are the kind of effects that we're going to be studying in material science to give us a list of properties, mechanical properties or material properties of a certain type of material. And those are the kind of terms that we use. Those deformations that I mentioned that happen to a body when a load is applied to it can either be elastic deformations, which are temporary. In other words, when you remove the load, the shape of that material will go back to what it was before. And plastic deformations are permanent changes in length or shape. And in general, and we'll see that on the stress strain graph in a minute, the degree of deformation is proportional to the amount of load that is applied to a material. And then we also have a concept of elasticity, and that's important for us to understand because it's the ability of a material to return to its original resting length after a load has been applied and then removed. So, well, again, we'll see that on the stress strain graph as well, but these are just some of the terms that we're going to be looking at. What is stress in a material? So it's actually the intensity of an internal force. It's very similar to pressure. And in fact, it has the same units as pressure, which is Newton per meter square or force per area, otherwise known as pascals. So whilst we can understand if a pressure is applied externally, we can understand that. Actually, when we apply a pressure, when we apply a force to a body, we may not see any obvious deformation, but there will be an intensity of that internal force within the body. And that's really what stress is. It's used to analyze the internal resistance of a body to a load. And normally something actually has to go on in there, because if you apply Newton's third law is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you're applying a force onto a body, something is going to be happening within that body to resist the force that is applied on it, even if it doesn't move. So those are some of the principles. So stress basically comes in two forms. You can have a normal stress, which is a load, which is when a stress or force is applied perpendicular to the body that they act on. So that would be a typical example, would be a tensile or compressive stress, or you can have shear stresses, which you can see in this diagram down at the bottom, where the forces are parallel to each other, and they act in a different way because of that. So we've mentioned stress, and that has the units of Newton per meter squared or pascals. Now strain is measured as the change in length over the original length of an object. In other words, the length is measured in meters, so it's meters over meters, and therefore they cancel each other out. And so strain has no units. I've seen that come up in multiple choice questions, occasionally in a Viva. What are the units of stress? Oh, they're Newton per meter squares. What are the units of strain? Answer, it has no units. It's a proportion. It's the change in length over the original length of a material. And what's interesting about strain is stress and strain are proportional to each other on a graph up to a certain limit. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But that is called Hooke's law. So those two are going to give you a straight line for an orthopedic material up to a certain limit. That means that they're proportional, and that limit, although it does have different names, which I'll go through, is generally referred to as the proportional limit. So I want to come on to the stress strain graph. But before I do, I just want to talk to you a moment about the Young's modulus, because the Young's modulus is actually a measure in the stress strain graph of the slope of that proportional zone within the elastic zone. And the Young's modulus, which I'll show you on the graph in a second, is a measure of stiffness of a material. And quite often there are questions about stiffness of a material because it does have a relation to the to the effects within a system, like for instance stress shielding and things like that. So we'll talk about that in a second as well. And the E, which is the measure of Young's modulus of elasticity, is unique for every material. So sometimes we want to know where it is in relation to each other. So different relative Young's moduluses. And the higher the E, the greater the forces that a material can withstand. So let me show you this. This is quite an important graph to try and remember some of the details from. So it's the first time we've seen a stress strain graph. So you can see the stress here on this axis. You can see the strain down here on this axis. And what you can see is a straight line for all of these different materials, which I've drawn here, not to scale, but showing you the relative stiffnesses, because remember, it's the slope that dictates the stiffness of a material. That is the Young's modulus. And they're straight lines because, according to Hooke's law, the stress will be proportional to strain up until the elastic limit. And I've drawn them all for each case up to the elastic limit. So what we can see here on this stress strain graph is that some materials like ceramics are very stiff. Then we've got cobalt, chrome, then stainless steel and titanium. Then we've got cortical bone. And that's important because a commonly asked question is, which metal is most similar to cortical bone in its stiffness or in its Young's modulus? And the answer there would be titanium alloy. You can see that of the three main metals that we use in orthopedics, cobalt chrome is the most stiff, whereas stainless steel sits between cobalt chrome and titanium. You can see some of these other materials coming down here, like polymethyl methacrylate. You can see high density polyethylene there, cancellous bone, and then coming down to some of the biological tissues that really don't have much strength. So that's a pretty useful graph to remember, especially up at the top end, as those do tend to come up in multiple choice questions occasionally, if you haven't done that yet. So when it comes to the stress strain graph, the way that they're actually measured in metals is they put a set piece of metal within a special kind of vise, which I've shown here, and they pull that vise, they pull that metal apart, and they measure the stresses and the change in length within it. And so, just coming on to the next one. So here is the stress strain graph. This is the kind of graph that you may be expected to draw in a Viva. They might say, can you draw me a stress strain graph? And they're going to ask you about certain points of it. So we have to remember stress is here on the y-axis, strain on the x-axis. And the first thing we could draw is a straight line for our representative material, because we know that stress is proportional to strain up until the proportional limit. And the slope of that is going to give us the Young's modulus. And that if we apply a, say, tensile force to this material before we get to the proportional limit, and we remove that stress at any point, the strain will be such that it returns exactly to the same length that it had at the beginning. And what that means is that the material is in the elastic zone. It is the elastic zone because it has the ability, if you remove the load at any point during that element of the stress strain graph, it will return to its original length. If you go beyond the proportional limit, then new things start to happen, which I'll show you. Unfortunately for us, the proportional limit has a number of different names which you can read in different books, like proportional limit, yield point, elastic limit. But within the context, you just have to realize that there's this absolutely critical point on the stress strain graph where you move out of the elastic zone into the plastic zone, and that is something like yield point or proportional limit, depending on what the particular question is asking. So if we carry on then along the stress strain graph, what we're going to see is that this is exactly what we've looked at before. So we get to the proportional limit or the yield point. If we carry on applying this tensile strength, what immediately happens as you begin to get deformation within the material is it actually releases some of the stress in the material. So you can see the stress going down. If, for instance, you took away the load at that particular point, what would happen is that you would get some elasticity, but you would not return to the same length that you had when you first started. And so you would have a deformation. And we call that deformation, if a load is removed, the plastic strain deformation. In other words, you've reached the elastic zone, you've gone through the elastic zone, you've had permanent deformation, but then you've released it, and that's the final plastic strain deformation that you're left with. If you don't remove the load and you carry on applying increasing load to that material, you find that the stress begins to build up again. The stress builds up and up and up until it gets to a point where no more stress can be held within that particular material. And we call that the ultimate strength. In this case, it's a tensile test, so we would call it the ultimate tensile strength, but it can be the ultimate strength. Sometimes we talk about, is a material strong? Well, that all depends on how much stress, what is the maximum stress that that material can cope within it. And what then happens if you carry on applying you carry on applying load even after you've reached your ultimate strength, the actual material itself begins to thin down in diameter until it gets to the point where it snaps and breaks. And that's why you get this necking, it's called, just a release of some of the stress just before the break point. It's because you're changing the shape of the piece of material that you're testing as that begins to really begin to pull apart. So, and that point where it pulls apart, we call the break point. So if we were to look at the whole of the graph, we would see that we have an elastic zone. That's absolutely critical. Nice straight line. Remember Hooke's law, stress is proportional to strain within the elastic zone, and that if we were to remove the load, it would come back to its original length. But if we go past the yield point or proportional limit, then we enter into this plastic deformation that ultimately goes up to the ultimate strength and then down to the break point. And all of that, within that, is called the plastic zone, because if we remove the load at any point during this, we will have some plastic strain deformation. And that is these are the really key points of the stress strain curve that we need to understand, because from that we get a lot of information. So the other thing that we can tell when we look at two different materials on a stress strain graph is whether they're brittle, and the opposite of brittle is ductile. And brittle basically means that the distance between the proportional limit and the break point is very close, whereas a ductile material is able to undergo a lot of plastic strain deformation or plastic deformation, and so the distance between the proportional limit and the break point is far. In this particular example, we would be looking at these two materials. If I asked you which was the strongest material, you could potentially say, and you'd be right, that the brittle material here is stronger because it's able to reach a slightly higher ultimate tensile strength than this more ductile material. So it's interesting, isn't it? So we have to get the terms precisely, but strength really relates to how much is the maximum amount of stress that can be contained within a material. Because the other element that we need to talk about is this concept of toughness. And what's important about material properties is to recognize a difference between the idea of strength, which is the ultimate tensile strength, or toughness, which is actually a measure of the total strain energy. And the total strain energy is the area underneath the stress strain graph. So what you can immediately tell is that when you have a more ductile material, it's going to have an increased range of this plastic deformation. There's going to be a long distance between the proportional limit there and the break point there. So a ductile material will have a lot of area under the graph. That is a measure of the total strain energy. And if you have a very high total strain energy, that's the amount of energy that a material is able to absorb before it breaks, then it will be a tough material. So perhaps you can see now the difference between strength and toughness. In this, I've gone back one slide, but in this slide, you can see that this material is strong, but this material is tough. So that gives you some more things that you can talk about if you're looking at a stress strain graph with somebody. A couple of other things that do come up that I want to mention about stress is that in terms of stress, there are two other sort of viscoelastic properties that we make use of in orthopedics. I haven't talked a lot about viscoelastic properties in this talk, but elastic we have talked about. Do you remember the elastic zone, the plastic zone? When you add visco, it's a measure of what fluids do. And so when you have biological tissues like bone, tendon, cartilage, they actually behave slightly like liquids and slightly like solids. And together they have this thing called viscoelastic properties. So when we're talking about bone now, we have these two other material properties that I'd like to mention. One of them is called creep and the other stress relaxation. Creep, actually, you don't see that so much with bone, but you see it with bone cement. And it's the ability of a material under a constant load to begin to flow like a liquid, ever so slowly, but it begins to do that. A good example of that would be in a very old building like a cathedral that's 1,000 years old. If you look at the stained glass windows in that, you see that although the glass is a solid, it's actually dripping over 1,000 years, and it's collecting at the bottom of the pane, and it's much thinner at the top of the pane. And we see that also in bone cement, where gradually over a 20-year period that polished tapered stem is inside the hip, for instance, it's actually creeping into the interstices of the bone over time because of the constant load applied to it because of the polished tapered stem. So that's something that can sometimes come up. And stress relaxation is a very practical thing that's worth knowing. If you're sticking in an intramedullary nail or perhaps an uncementated acetabular cup, but wherever you have a round area of bone and you are pushing something in to get a press fit, and it's very tight, what's happening is you're creating a stress within the bone because you're applying a load. But one of the wonderful things about viscoelastic materials is that that stress will dissipate. That's called stress relaxation. So it gets a peak of stress, and then because it also behaves slightly like a liquid, it gradually dissipates. And that means that if you're hitting your acetabular cup in and you're hitting it really hard and fast, but not giving time for the stress, the hoop stresses that are building up in the acetabulum to dissipate, then you can get a fracture. I've seen that with intramedullary nails going down a slightly unreamed, isthmus of a bone. If you hit it too hard and fast, you're not giving time for the bone to relax, and as a consequence, you can end up with fractures because you're not allowing stress relaxation to occur. So just coming on, just check the time, but I think we're okay for a few more minutes. I wanted to talk about some of the materials in particular that we use in arthroplasty and orthopedics. When we talk about arthroplasty and some of the complications that we get, we're mainly looking at, in this case, some of the complications of metal. And I want to mention fatigue failure. Now, if you take a paper clip and you just move it gradually up and down, eventually it will snap. And that is called fatigue failure. It's defined as repetitive loading cycles that are below the ultimate strength of material, but because there's so many of them, it actually ends up causing a fracture. And we can see that, we can often see it, for instance, in plates. When a fracture is slow to heal, we end up getting movement of the plate, and then the plate will snap. They don't tend to snap because they're bad plates. They tend to snap because the fracture hasn't healed before you've got fatigue failure. But in some situations, and an example would be an airplane wing, airplane wings do move a little bit when you take off and land. You don't ever want the airplane wing to fall off. So there's this concept of an endurance limit. And that means no matter how many millions and millions and millions of times you put a material through a load, it will never reach the stress that will allow it to get fatigue failure. So you can repeatedly cycle it without fear of getting complications like fatigue failure. The problem is that endurance limit often means that things have to be very big. For instance, a plate would have to be massively bulky and not very practical. So in the end, sometimes you just can't use the endurance limit in orthopedic situations because it would be impractical. So what about the metals we use? And I'm just going to talk really about three main metals: stainless steel, cobalt chrome, and titanium alloy. And stainless steel, as you probably know, is surgical grade stainless steel 316L, L standing for low carbon. That does tell you that it has some carbon in it. And so sometimes you can find questions that ask you about what kind of stainless steel that is. And it's surprising how many things are found in the alloy of stainless steel. Iron is about 2/3, but you've also got, look how much chromium you've got and how much nickel. Quite a lot of nickel in there. And of course, some people have nickel allergies, so that's worth thinking about. So stainless steel is an alloy that's made up of about 2/3 iron, but then it's also got a lot of chromium, quite a lot of nickel, and it's got molybdenum. There are two metals that have molybdenum: stainless steel and cobalt chrome. There's no molybdenum in titanium. So if you get a question that's talking about that particular element, then it's either one of these. And of course, there is carbon in stainless steel, but in this case, it's very low carbon. And you can imagine if somebody was to say to you, if someone was to, someone's to give you like an extra total hip replacement in your Viva and say, what is this extra total hip replacement made of? You might say, That is a grade, surgical grade stainless steel 316L. It's an alloy of iron, chromium, molybdenum, carbon. And the material properties, well, it's strong, it's tough because it's ductile. You know, it has a Young's modulus. It'd be good to talk about that. That's not too far away from cortical bone. But some of the other good things are that it's biocompatible, so it doesn't cause a lot of reaction within the body, except for people that have a nickel allergy. So that's one thing to think about. Many of those things are true about cobalt, chrome as well. The key thing about cobalt and chrome is that those are the main elements of it. Cobalt, chrome, and then just like stainless steel, it's got this molybdenum in it. You could use all of the same terms to describe it, but if you were talking about the Young's modulus, which I think would be a good idea, you would say that cobalt chrome has the highest Young's modulus of the metals that we use in orthopedics. It's higher than stainless steel and it's higher than titanium. And therefore, whilst it has some good properties like, you know, wear properties, we have to be a little bit careful of things like stress shielding of bone. And in fact, some implants like the CPT implant, which is a hip implant, which is a polished tapered stem, is made out of cobalt chrome, and it's said to have a slightly higher periprosthetic fracture rate than the Exeter, which it looks very similar to, but they're made of different materials. And the stiffness of the cobalt chrome could be playing a factor in that. And the other key thing that gets asked about cobalt chrome is what if you use it in something like a metal on metal hip replacement? Obviously you get a lot of chromium and cobalt ions, and that causes necrosis of the tissues around and can cause systemic problems as well. So the other metal I wanted to mention was the titanium. We use titanium a lot. If you can remember that it's mainly made out of titanium, but it's actually a titanium alloy, and it has some aluminium and some vanadium in it as well. And the lovely thing, there's a couple of really good things to remember about titanium. One is that its Young's modulus, that measure of stiffness, is the most similar to cortical bone of any of the metals that we've mentioned. It, just like the other metals, it's ductile, which makes it very tough, but also strong. And it's biocompatible. And one of the nice things is this particular property called self-passivation. So normally, if you take iron and it gets exposed to oxygen, it rusts. That's iron oxide. But if you take aluminium and you expose it to oxygen, it degrades into aluminium oxide, which is actually a ceramic. So you end up getting this layer of ceramic over the metal that protects it from further sort of corrosion. And titanium does that as well. So it creates a titanium oxide layer, which is actually a kind of ceramic, which stops it from undergoing any further corrosion. And that process is called self-passivation. It creates that layer that's resistant to corrosion. But you think titanium would be the perfect metal, but unfortunately it's got a weak area, and that is it's very poorly resistant to wear. I've not talked so much about wear because it's also a big subject, but in general, we don't want to use titanium in a bearing surface because it's poorly resistant to wear. A couple of other things just to mention are polyethylene. It's a plastic, so if you wanted to talk about its material properties, you could definitely talk about it being ductile. So it has a long range within that plastic zone. It's also got some good wear properties, but it has a low Young's modulus. You know where we use it. One or two things about the material properties of polyethylene that sometimes come up, in that they can be modified by the radiation that's used to sterilize it. So actually radiation can improve its wear characteristics, but it has a negative effect on its Young's modulus, its ductility, and its strength. And historically, although they don't do it anymore, of course, they sometimes used to irradiate in air, but that created free radicals, which led to very poor wear characteristics. Moving on, bone cement. We know that it's made of polymethyl methacrylate. It's not an adhesive, rather a grout, and it helps to give us even load distribution. And one of the wonderful things about it, which we've mentioned already, is this ability for it to undergo creep. I've mentioned this word anisotropic, and that means, isotropic means that it has the same mechanical properties. It doesn't matter which direction the load is applied. But almost all materials, at least in the body, are anisotropic, and they will have different abilities to resist forces depending on whether they're in tension or compression. And people love to talk about vacuum mixing as well. You might have a view on that. So coming up towards the end now, but I just wanted to mention ceramics. Ceramics, if you were to talk about their material properties, they are brittle. They have a very short distance between the end of the elastic zone at the proportional limit and the break point. They have a very high Young's modulus. It's even higher than cobalt chrome. They have this property called wettability. Although this is another one of those wear properties, its ability for a drop of water put on a ceramic head to spread over the ceramic head. And it does that in a much better way than if you were to put the same drop of water, for instance, on a stainless steel head. And you can polish them to get a very smooth surface, allowing you to have very low wear. So I'm sorry for the speed at which we've rushed through some of the mechanical properties, but we've looked at that stress strain graph, and I would love it if by the end of this evening, you felt that you could draw a stress strain graph and mention some of the key things on it, like the elastic zone, the plastic zone, the proportional limit. You could explain what Hooke's law was. You could explain what ductility, brittleness, strength, toughness, the area under the graph. That would be really good. And those things would get you through any Viva question that you'd be asked on that kind of thing. We've talked a little bit about viscoelastic materials. In particular, I've mentioned creep and stress relaxation. We've talked about some of the particular materials. We've talked about 3 metals: cobalt, chrome, stainless steel, and titanium. And we've looked at 1 or 2 of the other materials that we use in orthopedics as well. So thank you so much, and happy to answer any of your questions.
That's lovely, Alan. Many thanks for this presentation. You've managed in half an hour to squeeze a lot of information in this presentation. It's wonderful, very useful, and very interesting as well. Lots of, I think you pitched it exactly at the level of the exam, what candidates need to know. And I wouldn't expect that candidates need to know any more than this at all. If you know what's in this lecture about principles of biomaterials, you'll get through the stations. So thank you very much, Alan. I enjoyed that, and I'm sure everyone did. It was lovely.
Thank you.
So there have been lots of questions which myself and the other mentors tried to answer. A lot of questions, I think, you know, maybe you could help us with that. But I think one of the candidates was, there's a bit of confusion about ductility of titanium and its notch sensitivity. And these obviously describe completely 2 different parts of the titanium. So notch sensitivity describe the surface of an implant as an articulating surface, but ductility describe the actual material from the inside and how it behaves. So I think in the exam, it's probably, you need to be careful what you're describing and just use the terminology right. So notch sensitivity, you can correct me, Alan, but it doesn't come into the equation of ductility at all, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just describing the surface of the implant.
It's kind of the microscopic surface in a way, and it just means that actually it's easy to scratch it.
Yeah,
it's easy to scratch it, and when you get those scratches, they, for instance, if they're rubbing up against ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, they're going to scratch the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, giving you increased wear debris. So it's very, very small scratches, but it's just not scratch resistant. So, but when we talk about ductility, That's true for all metals, and that is a slightly different thing. That's its ability to undergo plastic strain deformation. It's that long distance between the proportional limit and the break point.
Yeah, I think in the exam, the way I had it in my head is that when describing any material is describe, if asked about materials, describe the manufacturing of it, what is it made of, what are the surface properties, and what are the actual material properties. So I think, and if you just divide this into those components, it'll be a lot easier during the exam to go systematically. So there was some other questions. I think candidates wanted to know a lot about the difference between proportional limit, elastic limit, and the yield point. The first question is, do we need, for the FRCS, do they need to worry about the difference between them, or can we just describe them as one term, as transitional points between the elastic and the plastic zones?
Exactly. So, I mean, I think if you're in a Viva situation, you can describe it any way that you want, and most likely somebody will give you, I don't know about COVID, but often they used to just give you a pencil and a piece of paper and say, show me what you mean. But the problem comes when you are answering multiple choice questions, because there, the same point could be coming up in different with different sort of names. All of those three things that you mentioned, the yield point, proportional limit, and elastic limit, are exactly the same thing. But sometimes in North America, they like to use yield point more than proportional limit. So there's just a sort of cultural difference in different parts of the world as to which term people prefer. And so I guess it depends which multiple choice that you're practicing on. But I would think for the Viva, it's no problem. You just have to explain whichever term you use. I'm sure the examiners will be familiar with it. So you could just go ahead and use it.
That's lovely. Yeah, I think I agree with you. When I was doing the exam, I didn't really, it's so complex, and as you said, different references speak about them differently. So was one interesting point you mentioned about the titanium, the self-passivation of the titanium. Now, does that mean that titanium can be mixed with other metals? For example, can you put the titanium stem and cobalt chrome head?
Okay, so great. So it's a question about galvanic corrosion here. So I haven't really gone into the different types of corrosion, but galvanic corrosion means that you're going to get accelerated corrosion because of mixing two different metals and they're swapping electrodes. And the two metals, by the way, just before I answer your question, I feel like a politician, but I'll just get this in, because the two metals that get the most galvanic corrosion that you should almost always avoid mixing together are stainless steel and cobalt chrome. Actually, probably the correct answer for the exam is don't mix your metals because you're going to get galvanic corrosion. In reality, if you're going to have to mix one metal in, then titanium, because it's able to self-passivate, it actually is more resistant to galvanic corrosion than any of the other metals. So for the exam, avoid mixing metals. Always avoid mixing cobalt chrome and stainless steel, which are highly sensitive to galvanic corrosion. And remember that there's some resistance to galvanic corrosion in titanium because of the process of self-passivation.
That's lovely, Alan. I think you're very good at using the buzzwords, which they can describe a complex concept in few words. Well, I think all the candidates need to learn use these buzzwords: galvanic corrosion and so on. Hooke's law, all these things. They can mean a lot in the exam situation, and you could redirect the station according to that. So many thanks, Alan, for that. Unfortunately, for you, because of this interesting lecture now, everyone asking more. They want to know about other parts of the material. They want to know more about tribology part, about hysteresis and so on. So, but I think this maybe if you could kindly find us time in the future again for another lecture. I think that will be very popular for everyone. But obviously you cannot cover all aspects of the biomaterials in a short lecture like that, but this is very stimulating, this one. So thank you very much, Alan. Now I know you have a lot more still, so we'll get on with that. So next part will be the MCQ part. So if Ruth could kindly put the questions on. Please everyone answer these questions, 3 questions. You have just about 3 minutes to answer, all anonymized. I encourage you all to attempt, please. At least you will know if you've answered correctly, and you will know if you have a deficiency that you need to cover. And also we know how much you benefited from the lecture today. Alan will take us through the answers afterwards with some explanation. Questions, please.
Great, yeah. So I can see that there's a lot of concordance on that first question. Just going to pull it back up, sorry. So which of the following materials has a Young's modulus of elasticity most similar to cortical bone? So this is really the one, you may remember that one graph of the relative Young's modulus. That's one that's worth putting in the memory somewhere, at least the first part of it, because titanium is the correct answer. So you guys have done so well on that, because it's the metal that has the closest Young's modulus to cortical bone. Zirconia is a type of ceramic used particularly in femoral heads, but actually there's one type of knee replacement that's also using that, the femoral part. And so it's being a ceramic, it actually has a very high Young's modulus. Stainless steel is actually the next one up from titanium. And then the third one up is the cobalt chrome. And then the last one, and the most stiff of all, is the ceramic, of which we have 2 represented here, the zirconia and the stainless steel. And I'm just going to show you this slide again. So you can see there that that's basically what we're looking at. We can see the different ones that I mentioned. So the most important thing to remember there is really the order that you've got here. And even if you can't remember that, just remember titanium equals cortical bone. I think you've done that pretty well because you all got that right, more or less. Okay, next one. Which of the following defines the stress at which a material begins to undergo plastic deformation? This is a question about the proportional limit, but they're probably not going to use that term. So they've said toughness. Now, you remember that toughness is the area under the stress strain graph, and materials that are tough have high ductility because there's a long distance between the yield point and the break point. Ultimate strength is actually the highest point in the stress strain graph where it gets the maximum stress that it can hold, so it's not that one. The yield strength. This is yet another term. I would have been happier. This is taken straight from the Orthopaedics UK Guide exam. So they put the yield strength. Now, the strength, remember, it's a measure of the stress that a material can hold, and it's measured by the amount of stress that can be measured on the y-axis. And it is actually a certain strength at which point it yields and moves from the elastic to the plastic zone. And so that is the correct answer, yield strength. Fatigue strength, that's something different. Remember, that's when it's below the level, which is the breaking point stress, and but it's multiple cycles which cause it to fail. And endurance limit is related to fatigue strength, but it's the maximum stress that you can do unlimited amounts of cycling and not get fatigue strength. So yield strength is the correct one there. And the key word there really is yield. Yield is the term that describes going from the elastic to plastic zones. Then the last question, the elements of chromium, molybdenum, cobalt are the basic components of which following implant materials? So aluminium oxide, no, that isn't the correct one. That is basically made of aluminium and oxygen. Oh, I can't say it. Cobalt chrome or cobalt alloy is the correct answer. So remember, it's mainly chromium, but it has cobalt molybdenum in there as well. And then stainless steel has molybdenum, but it doesn't have any cobalt or chrome. It's iron, molybdenum, nickel, and a little bit of carbon. And PMMA, that's polymethyl methacrylate. Nobody thought that. Tantalum, I haven't mentioned tantalum, but tantalum is a rare earth metal, and it's used by particular companies because you can get very nice sort of modeling, microarchitecture of tantalum, but it's not that commonly used, although it is probably something that we ought to start thinking about in the future, including as a material. But it itself is an element. It's a metal element. So that's the answer to the polls. And I don't know if you want to follow up, Firaz.
No, I think that's fantastic. It's very good to see that most candidates have answered the correct one. Thank you for the explaining. Obviously, there's some confusion about the stainless steel. Obviously, stainless steel doesn't contain chromium and cobalt. So, so this very, I think this very typical FRCS exam questions. And it's good to get used to this question. So it's very suitable. Thank you very much, Alan. So we will move on now next to, Alan has prepared the 3 case discussions, typical exam case discussions, and he's going to tell us the perfect answer or a model answer for these 3. And that's to prepare you guys for the Viva components afterwards.
Thank you so much. So I think when I was thinking about case discussion and material properties, I was trying to think, well, how does this actually come up in my experience? And I think the way that it most commonly comes up is people ask you some simple questions to start off with, and then suddenly you find yourself talking about material properties. And one of the ways, I'll just get my slides up for that. One of the ways that they do that is looking at the hip replacement. So in my experience, they'll say something like, "Oh, Alan, have you ever seen a hip replacement?" You're like, "Yep." And then they'll say, "Well, what hip replacement do you use in your practice?" And then they say, "Well, I use the Exeter total hip replacement and a cemented stem and a cemented cup." And then the very next question that they might follow on with is say, I use that. So what is the Exeter hip replacement made out of? And then it can become a little bit embarrassing if you've said that you use that one in your practice, but you don't really know what it's made out of. But hopefully, whichever one you pick, then I think you should be able to talk a little bit about it. So for instance, I think if you pick a cemented femoral stem, you need to be able to talk about what it's made of. And so I mean, you could pick whichever one you want, but if you pick the Exeter total hip replacement, then you could talk about the fact that it's made of surgical grade stainless steel. That's the 316L low carbon stainless steel. And you think that that is a good choice for a stem because it's going to have a Young's modulus, which is not too far off the cortical bone, but it's better than titanium because titanium has very low resistance, scratch resistance. And when you're talking about putting it inside the polished, having a polished tapered stem inside cement, you're going to end up getting scratching of the metal on the cement, which would create a lot of titanium wear debris. And that's why stainless steel is much better than titanium and it's the next one that's closest to cortical bone in the metals that we use in its Young's modulus. Obviously, if they say, what is Young's modulus? You can say it's a measure of stiffness of the material. And they can say, well, if Young's modulus is important, what if we have too high a Young's modulus? And you could talk about some implant companies make a polished tapered stem with cobalt chrome, and that would be the Zimmer prosthesis, which uses, it's called the CPT, and that particular prosthesis uses cobalt chrome, so it has a higher Young's modulus. But there is some concern with that prosthesis that it has a higher periprosthetic fracture rate because it's potentially a very stiff area in an elderly patient going into a less stiff area at the end of the prosthesis, creating this sudden step off and a place where stress can concentrate, resulting in periprosthetic fractures. Although, of course, it's hotly debated. But you could talk then about the material principles, why stainless steel has the advantage over cobalt chrome. So when it comes to the stem, you could also talk about the advantage of using polymethyl methacrylate. You could talk about the way that the cement creeps over time and allowing a sort of repeated microlock because of the constant load that the polished tapered stem applies on the cement. As the bone remodels around the cement, it allows that cement to continue to creep and create the microlock over time, minimizing the chances of loosening. Of course, you must say that in order to get that constant load, you can't have end loading of the prosthesis. And that's why you have that small sort of air pocket at the end of the prosthesis, which is created by the centralizer to allow there to be space there to give load along the sides of the polished tapered stem. And you could also mention how important it was to have a kind of uniform thickness of cement around the polished tapered stem so that you could allow that load to dissipate evenly. And 2 millimeters is thought to be the ideal amount. When it comes to the acetabulum, most of the bearing surfaces or the bearing surface that I would choose if they were asking me what I used in my practice would be ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. And I would use cross-linked polyethylene because it gives better wear properties. And I would use cement in this situation, or I would use an uncemented cup and a hybrid. And you could talk about whether you would modify your practice dependent on the patient that you were treating. For instance, a young patient might be able to tolerate greater hoop stresses that would be created from a press fit, uncemented stem. And they might ask you about hoop stresses, and you could mention about stress relaxation being important to leave time between impacts to allow the stress to dissipate so that you don't end up fracturing the bone. And you could talk about that. So then what I would also say is that you, if you like, the second part of my case discussion is about what if you want to use an uncemented femoral stem. I know that they're becoming more popular, especially for younger patients, where you have a good morphology of your proximal femur. And if you're going to use an uncemented femoral stem, or if they ask you about that, you could change your material. And in this case, titanium would probably be the preferable material. You're not so much worried about the scratch of the titanium against the bone inside the femur. But here, what you want is to have a Young's modulus of your metal that's as close as possible to that of cortical bone to minimize the effect of stress shielding. I can tell you more about stress shielding if you want. They might ask you about that. But basically, stress shielding is where all of the load is being carried by the implant to the distal bone. And the consequence of that is that according to Wolff's law, which is form follows function, if the bone is not being put under stress, then the bone will begin to gradually dissolve away and you'll have a reduced bone density in those places. So that's stress shielding. Some advantages of titanium are that it has a great Young's modulus, but it also allows you to get different kinds of coating on it. You can either actually change the shape of the metal to create a better lock into the bone, or you can blast it with this plasma spray to put a ceramic like hydroxyapatite onto the outside of the titanium. It bonds really well at about 2000 degrees centigrade. And that then creates a very good ability for the titanium to bond into the bone. But they might say, would you use a titanium head with your titanium stem? Answer, no, because titanium is not scratch resistant. And so it makes a very poor surface for bearing. And so perhaps a much better bearing surface would be something like a ceramic head. And then you, again, in the same way as we talked about for the previous case of cemented stem, you could talk about whichever acetabular cup you wanted. Most likely, unless you're doing a reverse hybrid, most likely, if you have an uncemented femoral stem, you'll use an uncemented acetabular component as well. And the best acetabular component would probably either be tantalum, which we did mention earlier. You could talk about that. That would be something like continuum cup, or you could talk about using titanium, again minimizing stress shielding, and often they have special coatings on them like a hydroxyapatite, and inside that cup you could either have a ceramic or a polyethylene cup. We could talk about that. So the last bit of this case discussion that I wanted to talk about was about knee replacements, because that's another way that this particular question about material properties can come up. They say something like, oh, you know, what type of knee replacements do you use in your practice? And then you say the name of it. In my practice, I'd use a Genesis 2 made by Smith & Nephew. It doesn't really matter what you pick, to be honest with you, as long as it's not crazy. But pick anything that's within the top 5 on the National Joint Registry. But take a moment to find out what the materials are in those, so that if anyone asks you about them, or if you get the opportunity to talk about it, you can talk about it with knowledge. So most knee replacements actually use cobalt chrome for the distal femur, for coating the distal femur. And the reason for that is that it actually isn't such a worry about stress shielding right down there like it would be in the proximal part of the femur. And you can really polish cobalt chrome so that you can get great wear properties. The tibial tray, of course, is made of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, often cross-linked. But interestingly, the base plate is normally made of titanium alloy, which is a little strange because actually it's often cemented in place. And like I mentioned in the proximal femur, we don't like to mix cement and titanium, and yet in the proximal part of the tibia, it seems to be okay to mix those two together. Perhaps there's much less movement. Obviously, we're not relying on a polished tapered stem type model in the knee. And so in general, those are the 3 main components of a knee replacement: cobalt chrome for the femoral component, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene for the insert and also for the patella button, and then a titanium base plate, which is cemented in, both sides often cemented in, although of course there are plenty of uncemented total knee replacements as well. I've got this material, see if it comes up on the screen, but there's also another material which you might see. One particular company makes a material called oxinium. It's the only one that really looks black like this, and that's a ceramicized metal. It's a kind of hybrid of ceramic on the outside and metal on the inside, so that it's less brittle and less likely to fracture as total knee replacement femoral components made of ceramic are, but because it behaves like a metal, so less likely to fracture. But the very outer part of the metal is actually oxidized to create a smooth ceramic layer that can be polished. That's that particular proprietary brand called oxinium. So really that, I think, brings me to the end of those sort of case discussions. And I just wanted to give you an answer to the kind of question that you might get. What hip replacement do you use? What is it made of? What are the material properties of those particular things that it's made of? So hopefully if you get asked that, you'll have some ideas on how to answer it.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Alan. That covers it really. I think these are most commonly asked scenarios when they. So prepare when an examiner asks you what hip or what knee replacement you use. They're not just interested to know the brand. You could throw in any brand, as Alan said, as long as it's a well-established one. But they just want to take you further to know why you use this. So prepare one good answer and be ready that everyone talks about Exeter. So everyone will be prepared, examiners and everyone. So if you're gonna say Exeter in the exam, you have to know all about the ins and outs of Exeter and how it functions and the whole Exeter philosophy. So thank you very much, Alan. So now we will move on to the next part of this teaching session, which is hot seat Viva. And we have 3 candidates, obviously first come, first serve basis. And sorry for anyone who didn't get an opportunity. Today, obviously, as you know, we run some Viva courses now, and you'll find the next course advertised on the OR UK websites. So today we have 3 candidates. So we will time you guys to 5 minutes for question. And then we will give you feedback for 5 minutes. There will be 2 examiners. One of them is Alan. And we'll have the second examiner will be one of the mentors. So